most of us already know how powerful nature is. Especially when heavy rain starts falling or a freak gust of wind nearly lifts you off your feet. But there have been some downright crazy events that almost look like Mother Nature's flexing her muscles and showing off a bit. From a doorway to the underworld to Locust invasions, here are 20 events that show the real power of nature. The Gates of Hell. The Gates of Hell is the name given by locals to the Darvaza gas crater. It's a 230-foot wide hole in Turkmenistan's Karakum Desert near the village of Darvaza that's been on fire for over 50 years and is showing no signs of burning out. The crater was created in 1971 when a Soviet drilling rig made a serious mistake. They accidentally punctured a large underground natural gas cavern, which caused the ground to collapse and swallow the drilling rig. As they had opened up the large pocket of gas, poisonous fumes had started to leak out. So, to stop an environmental catastrophe, the Soviets decided to set it alight. They believed that by lighting the gas on fire, they could burn it off, and the fire would die out in a few weeks. Except, it's now been decades, and it's still on fire. Even though it's called the Gates of Hell, which makes it sound like something you should definitely avoid, it's become quite the tourist attraction. People trek into the desert to see it, and the country's government is encouraging it as a tourist site. It's also become quite the hotspot, pardon the pun, for wild campers. A crazy fire tornado. Because a normal tornado isn't terrifying and destructive enough, Mother Nature has to add one with fire to make things truly interesting. In 2020, when the world was already dealing with a pandemic, a series of these nightmare tornadoes made up of smoke and flames hit California's Lassen County. The fire spread to decimate over 20,000 acres of land, and the National Weather Service in Reno, Nevada issued a new weather warning for the first time, a fire tornado warning. Fire tornadoes contain tornado-like wind speeds that form when smoke plumes act like thunderstorms. The wildfire started producing smoke plumes that grew up to 30,000 feet high and started making lightning strikes. They then began to rotate as they encountered a change of wind speed and direction relating to altitude. As you can imagine, these fire tornadoes were incredibly dangerous for firefighters, but also for residents. In a regular tornado, residents are told to get into their basements, but a new set of instructions had to be quickly written for staying safe in one made of fire. They were told to avoid specific areas and follow the evacuation orders of authorities. Funnel cloud. When U.S. pilot David Evans was flying his glider near Oklahoma City in June of 2021, he decided to find a thermal area to keep his glider upward. He followed hawks, which is generally a good sign of a thermal patch, but ended up flying through the center of a storm and basically into a tornado. David was flying his glider in wide circles and noticed that he was experiencing a small amount of lift. He then saw a spout that went up to the base of the clouds and had formed above his glider. Realizing this was a unique moment, he got out his camera as the funnel cloud started to narrow and strengthen around him. David said the thermal patch was raising him at heights of up to 200 feet a minute before the vapor funnel began forming, but there was no turbulence. He just continued to fly around it. His footage ended up being shared on social media and drew in viewers from around the world who were amazed by his experience. According to meteorologist Ryan Bunker, the funnel cloud was a tornado, but was closer to being a land spout. This term describes a weak, short-lived system that isn't associated with a mesocyclone. Floods in eastern China. As if 2020 wasn't already bad enough for many countries, eastern China was delivered another blow in the form of flooding. Dams featuring on the Poyang, which is the largest freshwater lake in the country, reached capacity and burst as the lake reached record water levels. 33 rivers also reached record highs in July 2020 as a result of downpours along the Yangtze River, with 98 in total at an alarming level. It's probably not surprising that several building collapses were recorded as a result of this unprecedented rainfall. Around 140 people, if not more, were reported to have died, and millions were evacuated from their homes. Thousands of soldiers were also dispatched in Lushan to shore up the banks of the lake. The flooding was a severe problem from June until September, and by the middle of August, over 63 million people were affected. Around 219 people were missing or found dead, and 54,000 houses had collapsed. Wow! According to a spokesperson from the China Meteorological Administration, the incredible rains were caused by increased vapors from the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Many experts claim climate change is partly to blame and say that such events may happen more often in the future. The Evacuation of Plymouth. We often hear of different ghost towns around the world, typically sitting abandoned or with just a few residents left due to loss of industry. However, the story of Plymouth, the capital of the island of Montserrat, is a different story altogether. Montserrat is a UK overseas territory in the Leeward Island chain of Lesser Antilles in the West Indies that had many parts become permanently desolate in 1995. It had been built on historical lava deposits near the Soufriere Hills volcano, which had long been inactive. However, it had started erupting again in 1995. A series of massive eruptions began in July 1995, with fast-moving hot gas and volcanic matter covering a vast area of southern Montserrat, including Plymouth. The following month, fragmented materials from the volcano started falling on the town, so residents were evacuated that December. Just a few months later, residents were allowed to return to their homes, but another colossal eruption resulted in the deaths of 19 people, leading to yet another evacuation. After even more eruptions, about 80% of the town was destroyed and buried under almost 5 feet or 1.4 meters of ash. Half of the island was declared an exclusion zone. Between 1995 and 2000, about 2/3 of the entire island's population had been made to flee, and many settled in the UK, leaving only around 1,200 people or less on the island by 1997. However, there were almost 5,000 people living there by 2016. Cyclone Amphan. Why is it that some of the most devastating natural events happen in 2020? If it's not flooding and fires, it's a pandemic. Now it's a cyclone. Cyclone Amphan was a tropical cyclone that caused huge amounts of damage in eastern India and Bangladesh in May 2020. It was considered the strongest tropical cyclone to strike the Ganges Delta since 2007 and the first super cyclonic storm in the Bay of Bengal since 1999. When all was said and done, this Category 5 tropical storm had caused over $13 billion in damages and is among the costliest cyclones ever recorded in the North Indian Ocean. It reached its peak intensity with wind speeds of up to 150 miles or 240 kilometers an hour and had 1 minute sustained speeds of 170 miles an hour. The aftermath of the cyclone was serious. 128 people died in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka combined, and tens of thousands of homes were destroyed. Those who did survive often lost their livelihoods, homes, and land. Hundreds of thousands of acres of crops were destroyed, and thousands of farm animals, like chickens, also died. As power lines were wiped out, there was also significant power loss. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, ground teams were only available in small numbers, which made restoring infrastructure a slow process. Largest wave ever recorded. Surfers love chasing big waves, but even they would be running at the sight of the largest ever recorded wave that was documented in Lituya Bay in Alaska's southeast in 1958. The wave reached a peak height of 1,720 feet or 524 meters near the Gilbert Inlet and was the result of a magnitude 7.8 earthquake that caused a mega tsunami. Gilbert Inlet saw a rock slide of about 40 million cubic yards, or 30.6 million cubic meters, with the epicenter of the quake on the Fairweather Fault. Scientists say that rocks, debris, and even glaciers fell from an altitude of 3,000 feet, or 914 meters, with horrendous consequences. The massive wave was just the beginning. The shorelines were decimated entirely, and the occupants of a fishing boat called Sunmore anchored nearby lost their lives. However, those aboard two other boats, Badge and Edry, were able to surf the wave over the top of the trees and survive. The wave started in Gilbert Inlet as the earthquake was ending. It started as a kind of explosion before growing in height and becoming a giant water wall. According to those on board a boat in Anchorage Cove, the glacier dropped out of sight before the water arrived. Before they knew it, their boat was going over huge rocks and trees before crash landing in acres of wood debris. Fortunately, they were found by a rescue team. Nature reclaims Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a devastating nuclear accident in 1986 near Pripyat in the Soviet Union that saw a 30-kilometer or 18-mile area become completely off-limits to the public because of radioactive material and toxins in the atmosphere. But just because we're not there doesn't mean life doesn't go on in this partially abandoned city. In the absence of human activity, plant life and animals have been able to thrive. And it just goes to show how much of an impact we really have on our environment. Even with high levels of radiation, animal numbers are growing in the area, with incredible populations of beavers, deer, moose, and more exotic animals like brown bears, wolves, and lynxes. Even though these animals are likely affected by radiation from what they eat, they're probably unaware, mostly unaffected, and pretty much just living their best lives. Even plant life has been completely transformed in the wake of disaster. Experts believe some have become extra resilient to protect themselves by becoming more damage resistant and being able to repair themselves. As radiation levels were much higher in the past, the more recent plants have been able to draw upon the adaptations of plants early on in the disaster to withstand almost anything humans and nature throws at them. Deadliest heat waves. Most of us love a nice day out in the sun. You can go swimming, enjoy an ice cream, then recuperate with the coolness of air conditioning. But imagine if the heat was so extreme and for so many days that it was downright unbearable. Much of Western Russia knows all too well what that's like. They experienced a heat wave in 2010 that was unlike anything most residents had ever experienced before. In fact, the entire northern hemisphere experienced unusually high temperatures that had some devastating consequences. In Russia, the freak heat wave caused the deaths of up to 56,000 people who lost their lives from smog, forest fires, droughts, overheating, and drowning from swimming to beat the heat. The highest ever temperature was recorded on July 11th in 2010, when the Southern Republic of Kalmykia recorded a high of 111.2 degrees Fahrenheit or 44 degrees Celsius. Before 2010, the most severe heat wave recorded was in 2003, but this one was considered far more extreme because the average temperature for the region was much higher in that summer, which is how heat waves are measured. What also set it apart from the 2003 heat wave was that the skyrocketing temperatures were measured across almost 400,000 square miles, nearly doubling the area of the heat wave 7 years earlier. The Puebla Sinkhole. In June 2021, the Sanchez family got the shock of their lives when they heard what sounded like thunder and realized the earth around their house in Santa Maria Zacatepec outside of Mexico City was sinking. Water was starting to bubble, and they soon realized they had a huge problem. The hole in the ground threatening to consume their home started at just 5 yards large, but it quickly increased in size to about 75 yards. The police were forced to put up barricades to stop people from getting too close to it to keep everyone safe. Investigators also arrived at the scene to find out what had caused the sinkhole to form. The Puebla State Governor, Miguel Barbosa, said it was a matter of enormous risk. He said it was a geological fault that must be addressed with care, precautions, and techniques. Typically, sinkholes form when groundwater underground dissolves rock beneath the surface. The collapses tend to be sudden because the land tries its very best to stay intact before the spaces underground become too big to hold the weight of the earth above any longer. Later, experts noted that the colossal sinkhole was caused by limestone erosion. Local residents also argued that groundwater extraction by factories and a water bottling plant may have sped up erosion and water flow. The Batagaika Crater. The Batagaika Crater in Russia is the largest permafrost crater in the world. and it's growing. It's about 1 kilometer or 0.6 miles long, up to 100 meters or 328 feet deep, and hasn't finished expanding yet. The land inside the crater started sinking when surrounding forests were cleared in the 1960s, leading to thawing permafrost. Flooding also contributed, and now the crater's rim is unstable with regular landslides. This is sad to see, especially as our land clearing may be to blame, but it has also had some positive effects. We've been able to uncover vast amounts of fossilized materials that have given us insight into our environment from hundreds of thousands of years ago. Experts have found ancient forests, remains of horses, mammoths, muskox, and other animals, pollen, and climate data for about 200 to 650,000 years. Researchers believe that the crater is growing at a rate of up to 30 meters or 98 feet a year as the ice around the edges gives way. It's also becoming much deeper and can now reveal that the area was once covered by open tundra and a dense forest. There's hope that this crater will help experts understand the climate over tens of thousands of years and what may likely happen in the decades to come. The Yellowstone Revival. Wolves contribute a lot to the ecosystem, but sometimes it takes not having wolves to know how much they really do contribute. They had been eradicated in the West before 8 wild gray wolves were brought from Canada in 1995 and transported to Great Falls in Montana, where they could be reintroduced into Yellowstone Park. Now, there are about 9 packs in Yellowstone Park with 80 wolves, with the Yellowstone Project deemed a success. Between 1996 and 2004, those wolves managed to halve the elk population, which was more than overabundant. Having fewer elk meant vegetation had a chance to regrow and the streams became cleaner. With those changes came cougars, bears, and beavers. It's hard not to notice the difference in Yellowstone Park from just 3 decades ago. As ranchers were obviously not all that pleased about the reintroduction of wolves, many states introduced livestock reimbursement programs to make sure they received money for any livestock killed by wolves. Some farmers now say bears pose more of a risk to their livestock than wolves do. Insane Beijing sandstorm. We're all pretty much used to wearing masks when we're out in public now, but most people living in Beijing likely already had a supply of them as they grappled with crazy air pollution from sandstorms. In 2017, flights were canceled and residents were encouraged to stay inside after a sandstorm blew over the Chinese capital, which some people describe as an airpocalypse. The air was basically unsafe to breathe after a sandstorm plus industrial pollution came together. Official news agencies in China said 9 regions were affected by air pollution over 2 days, with visibility and breathability 2 enormous problems for residents to combat. According to local authorities, the air pollution crisis was blamed on sands that wind had blown in from Mongolia and Inner Mongolia. High concentrations of some particle types had been linked to lung cancer and strokes, so it was quite important for people to stay inside and wear masks if they had to leave their homes. A Greenpeace activist said the sandstorm was similar to those from about 20 years earlier, before a reforestation campaign had helped reduce the number of sandstorms reaching the capital. The formation of Surtsey Island. Realtors often tell us to snap up bare land because, well, the earth isn't making anymore. You can tell them they're wrong, and Surtsey Island is proof of that. Surtsey is a volcanic island in Iceland formed in 1963 after a fiery eruption. Over a period of about 3.5 years, the landmass came up from the Atlantic Ocean to create an island of about 1 square mile or 2.4 square kilometers. It had elevations of 560 feet or 171 meters above sea level and 290 meters or 950 feet above the ocean floor. Erosion has since reduced its height and trimmed the area back to about half a square mile, but it's still extra land that we didn't have before. It was also subjected to a column of steam about 4 miles high that caused a massive amount of ash to be rained over the area. After it cooled down, researchers began visiting Surtsey to explore the new plant and animal life that had decided to call the island home. It was also designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2008 and was named after the fire god of Icelandic mythology. As curious as you might be about visiting Surtsey, this island isn't open to the public, but you can visit the Surtsey Visitor Center in Haymai to learn more about it. The Tunguska Event. Early one morning in June of 1908, something strange happened in central Siberia. A massive object exploded approximately 6 miles above the stony Tunguska River area, causing an atmospheric shockwave that actually circled the Earth not once, but twice. 2 nights after that explosion, people noticed that the skies of Europe and Asia were strangely bright, almost comparable to how the skies looked in 1883 after the volcanic eruption at Krakatoa. Soviet Academy of Sciences Mineralogical Museum geologist Leonid Kulik traveled to Kansk in 1921 to see if he could find the giant meteorite that he thought may have been buried there if newspaper articles from the time were anything to go by. He traveled 435 miles across frozen countryside and found what he was looking for. The explosion had charred over 100 square kilometers of pine forest with the equivalent explosive force of 16 megatons of TNT. To put that into perspective, that's about 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Scientists now think a comet caused the explosion, while others believe it was a hefty 150 to 300 foot asteroid. The object actually exploded in the atmosphere above the Earth and created a fireball and blast wave, but not an impact crater. Only a few small fragments of the object were found. Biblical Locust Plague. A few locusts might not seem like a big deal, but in communities where they're basically taking over, it's a matter of life and death. Many villages in Kenya are battling massive locust invasions that have been taking over farms in rural Kenya. They are the worst swarms they've seen for about 70 years, with some experts warning that the worst is yet to come. These desert locusts are described as one of the world's most devastating pests. They can multiply 20-fold in a 3-month period and reach densities of 80 million per square kilometer. These pesky creatures also eat about 2 grams of vegetation each per day, which means 80 million desert locusts will eat as much food as 35,000 people would in 24 hours. Farmers who spend everything they have on planting for a bountiful harvest are now finding that their crops are entirely wiped out, as is food for their livestock. Some farmers are choosing to move their livestock to neighboring villages that aren't affected by the locusts to ensure they don't starve, but they have to pay a daily fee for land and feed. One farmer said the locust invasion is a challenge and a matter of life or death because it's left them hungry and confused. Insane Mayfly storms. If insects make you squirm, or you just like being able to drive your car without worrying about whether it's covered in insects, maybe don't move to northeastern Ohio. Every year or two, residents have to put up with incredible mayfly swarms that cover almost every surface for up to about a month. These mayflies come from the nearby Lake Erie. They start life as eggs in the lake sediment, then a year or two later, they grow wings and swim to the surface as adults. They're generally between a 1/4 inch to an inch long and swarm around northeastern Ohio for about 2 days before dying. Somehow, I don't think the crunch of bugs underfoot is quite as satisfying as the crunch of dead leaves in fall. As frustrating as these bugs are, they actually signal something good. Scientists say a mayfly swarm in summer can benefit the sport and commercial fishing industries around Lake Erie's western basin and other areas of the Great Lakes. Still, you won't find me jumping for joy for the fishing industry if I turn up to my vehicle and it's covered in an inch of insects. Fortunately, the fact that they only live for around 2 days means you can sweep them away from your property pretty quickly and they won't put up a fight. Brood X cicadas. Imagine waking up not to your alarm clock, but the sound of millions of cicadas. It might sound like the start of some biblical horror film involving locusts, but that's the actual reality in some parts of the United States. Every 17 years, billions of cicadas, known as Brood X, that have been living under the ground for their entire lives, feasting on sap from grasses and trees, burrow up from the dirt to become adults. They sing a love song, get down to business to produce their next generation, and then die a few weeks later. These cicadas are unique to the eastern United States and don't devour crops or travel far. They just breed like crazy to the tune of about 1.4 million cicadas per acre. There are almost 3,400 cicada species around the world, but two types are unique to the US, with one being the 17-year cicadas and another being 13-year cicadas. Three 17-year cicada species are found in the north, and the 13-year cicadas live in the south and the Mississippi Valley. There are also 12 broods of 17-year cicadas and 3 broods of 13-year cicadas, and they have the ability to shift their life cycles forward or backward by 4 years, depending on whether the conditions are going to suit their ability to breed. Spiders flee Australia floods. If you weren't already scared of spiders, then you will be now after seeing how they behave during floods in Australia. Now, we all know that Australia is not where you'd want to live if you're scared of spiders and snakes, but some Aussies you talk to will say you barely see them when you're out and about. However, that definitely was not the case when heavy rain hit Victoria. In the days after flooding hit the Gippsland region, trees and paddocks were blanketed in spider webs. In one area, a spider web was so large it covered an area of over 1 kilometer, or a bit over half a mile. According to experts, this is known as ballooning and is a survival tactic that spiders sometimes use. They throw out their silk to allow them to climb to higher ground and avoid drowning. A senior insects curator said it was likely that millions of ground-dwelling spiders had thrown their silk strands up into the trees to catch onto vegetation and escape the rising water levels. One woman, who's clearly a psychopath, just kidding, maybe, said it wasn't scary, but instead, it was beautiful. She said everything was covered in the beautiful spiderweb, including the trees and fences. Fish frozen in waves. In 2015, photographer and teacher Kelly Preheim snapped an incredible photo at the Lake Andes National Wildlife Refuge in South Dakota that showed an ice wall full of dead fish. It was almost like the lake had simply frozen instantly, giving the fish no chance to escape to warmer water. However, Kelly explained in great detail what actually caused the fish to be stuck inside a wall of frozen water and then become a delicious snack for bald eagles, American crows, and other wildlife. Kelly said the lake levels were low because of a drought and that the fish had died due to a lack of oxygen. When ice forms on the surface of a lake, it blocks out the sun and prevents plants and algae from photosynthesizing and making oxygen. As a result, oxygen levels in the water start to decrease. This kills off plants and algae, which then use even more oxygen to die and decompose. Fish end up dying from that lack of oxygen. Once they died, they floated to the surface. When the temperatures plummeted, ice expanded and was pushed to the shore, where it started to buckle and form vertically. The wind may have also driven the ice toward the shore. And this is how thousands of frozen fish ended up in an ice wall. Who knew nature could create such absurd, crazy, and terrifying events? I mean, a locust invasion? That almost seems biblical. What has been the craziest natural event you've been caught up in? We'd love to hear your story. Also, check out our other cool stuff showing up on screen right now. See you next time!